In the autumn of 1887, in a fold of the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana Territory, a young woman counted $2 into the gloved palm of a county clerk and walked away the owner of a building that 3 men in the room had already called a coffin. The smokehouse stood at the back edge of a foreclosed homestead, its doors spiked shut with iron, its single window blinded by 30 years of soot and grease. No one had opened it since the man who built it died. The clerk wrote her name in the ledger and did not bother to hide his smile. She did not see the smile, or chose not to. She had learned a long time ago that a thing sealed shut is only waiting for the right hand, and she had come a great distance to put her hands on something at last. Her name was Hannah Vesper, and she was 28 years old, and 3 months earlier she had owned nothing in the world but a wool coat, a leather satchel, and the tools that had belonged to a dead man. She had not wept when they put her out of the boarding house in Missoula. She had counted what she had, which was $4 and some change, and she had asked the only question that ever did her any good, which was what a person with steady hands and no money could buy that no one else wanted. The answer, in that country, in that season, was always the same. The thing no one wanted was the thing no one had troubled to open. Stay with her through what comes, because the floor of that smokehouse held something that had been waiting longer than she had been alive, and the county that laughed at her purchase would not be laughing by the first snow. To understand why a sealed smokehouse mattered to Hannah Vesper, you have to understand the man who taught her, and the man who taught her had been dead for 2 years. His name was Eli Vesper, and he was not her father by blood. He had found her at 9 years old, sweeping the floor of a wheelwright's shop in Helena for her meals, an orphan with no people that anyone could name, and he had watched her hands for a week before he said a word to her. When he finally spoke, he did not offer her pity. He offered her work. He was a joiner and a cooper and a maker of tight things, barrels and casks and cisterns, anything that had to hold what was put into it and let nothing out. And he told her that a person who could make a thing hold could also read how any made thing was meant to come apart. He raised her in that trade as if it were a language, and in a way it was. He taught her that wood remembers the hand that worked it, that a dovetail cut in winter sits different from one cut in July, that the man who builds a thing to last builds it the way he thinks, and that if you study the joinery long enough, you can know the builder you never met. She learned to read a floor the way other people read a letter. She learned that the most honest part of any building is the part nobody decorates, the part underfoot, where man only ever does what the work requires, and never what the eye admires. Eli Vesper died in the spring of 1885 of a cough that took him slowly, and he left her his tools and one sentence she would carry the rest of her life. A thing built to hide is built more carefully than a thing built to use, he told her, near the end, his voice gone to gravel. Look for the care, and you will find what the care was protecting. She had buried him with her own hands and gone on alone, taking what work a woman in the joinery trade could find, which was little and grudging. By the autumn of 1887, the little had run out. She had ridden south into the Bitterroot on a borrowed mule, following a notice of a tax sale tacked to a feed store wall, and she had stood at the back of a crowd of ranchers and speculators while a fast-talking man auctioned the pieces of a dead homesteader's land. The good acres went to a cattle concern out of Hamilton. The house went to a widower with sons. And when the auctioneer came to the last lot, a quarter-acre at the property's far corner holding nothing but a soot-blackened smokehouse, sealed shut with iron spikes, he made a joke of it. He said the lot came with a free puzzle, since no man present had been able to get the door open, and that whoever bought it would own the only smokehouse in the territory that smoked nothing but its owner's patience. The crowd laughed. He asked for $1 and got silence. He asked for 50 cents and got a cough. Hannah Vesper raised her hand and said $2, in a voice level enough that the men nearest her turned to look, and the auctioneer, delighted, brought down his hand before she could think better of it. What she had bought, the men around her believed, was a sealed box of rotten meat hooks and old smoke. What she saw was something else entirely. She had spent the slow hours of the auction, not watching the auctioneer, but watching the building, and the building had been speaking to her the whole time in the only language she trusted. The smokehouse was wrong, and she had known it was wrong within a minute of looking at it. It was too well built. A smokehouse is a humble thing, 4 walls and a roof to hang meat in and hold smoke, and a man throws one up in a weekend out of whatever lumber he has. This one had been built by someone who cared the way Eli had cared. The corners were dovetailed, not nailed. The sill logs sat on dressed stone, not dirt. The man who built this had built it to last 100 years, and no one builds a meat shed to last 100 years. He builds it that way when the meat is not the point. She paid her $2 and waited until the crowd had thinned and the wagons had pulled away down the valley road, and then she walked the quarter-acre alone in the long gold light of the afternoon and put her hands on the building for the first time. The logs were sound under the soot. The iron spikes driven through the door and into the frame were hand-forged, not bought, which meant the man who sealed this place had wanted it sealed badly enough to stand at a forge and make the nails himself. She pressed her palm flat against the door and felt nothing give. She circled the building twice. There was no other way in. Whoever had closed this place had meant it to stay closed. She did not force the door that first day. Eli had taught her that too, that a made thing forced is a made thing ruined, and that patience is only impatience that has learned to wait. She made a small camp against the smokehouse's south wall, picketed the mule, and ate the last of her bread in the dark, and she lay awake a long time listening to the wind come down off the mountains and thinking about a man who would forge his own spikes to seal the shed. A man in a hurry buys his nails. A man who forges them is not in a hurry. He is making sure. And a man making that sure is a man with something behind the door worth a great deal more than the door, because no one labors over the lock of an empty box. She turned that thought over until the fire burned down to coals, and somewhere in the turning of it, she understood that she had not bought a smokehouse at all. She had bought a question, and questions in her experience were the only things in the world that ever paid a poor woman back. The next morning she began to work, and the work was slow, and the valley watched. Water travels in thin country. By the second day a rancher's boy had ridden past and seen her there, a lone woman with a leather satchel of tools laying siege to a building everyone had given up on. And by the third day she had visitors. They came in at 2s and 3s, on horseback, on the pretext of checking a fence or looking for a strayed steer, and they sat their horses at the edge of the lot and watched her work the door with the particular silence of men waiting to be proven right. She did not perform for them. She did not explain herself. She worked the iron spikes one at a time with a thin pry and a wooden mallet, easing each one out of seasoned wood that had gripped it for 3 decades, and when a spike finally drew free with a long shriek of metal, she set it in a row beside the others and went on to the next. It took her 4 days to draw the spikes, because she would not split the frame to hurry it. There were 11 of them, driven in 2 rows down the door, and 3 more through the frame at the top, and each one had to be persuaded rather than forced. She worked from the head, scoring the wood around each spike with the point of a small chisel to free it from the grip of 30 years of swelling and shrinking, then setting the thin pry against the scored seam and tapping it home with the wooden mallet, a 1/4 inch at a time, listening to the wood as much as feeling it. Twice she misjudged the grain and felt the fibers begin to tear, and both times she stopped, withdrew the pry, and waited, because a torn frame would be a ruined frame, and a ruined frame would tell her nothing. Her hands cracked at the knuckles in the dry mountain air, and she wrapped them in strips of cloth and went on. The first spike took her most of a morning. The fourth came easier because by then she had learned the particular stubbornness of this man's iron and this man's wood, and a thing understood is a thing half won. The men at the edge of the lot did not understand what they were watching. With them it looked like a woman scratching at a door with a chisel, making no progress a horseman could see from 40 feet, and more than one of them rode off shaking his head at the waste of it. They did not know that she was not trying to open the door. She was trying to open it without harm, which is a different and far slower thing, and the difference between the two was the whole difference between Hannah Vesper and every man who had given up on that building in 30 years. On the fourth evening an old man rode up alone, and did not pretend to be looking for cattle. He was perhaps 70, lean and weathered to rawhide, with a white beard and a way of sitting his horse that said he had sat a great many of them. He watched her draw the second-to-last spike, and then he spoke. "You bought Amos Crane's Smokehouse," he said. It was not a question. Hannah set down her mallet and looked at him. "I bought the lot at the corner," she said. I did not know the man's name. "Nobody said his name in this valley in 30 years, the old man said. He looked at the building a long moment, and something moved in his weathered face that was not quite grief and not quite fear. Amos Crane built that with his own hands the year before he disappeared. Folks said he ran off owing money. Folks said a lot of things. He sealed that door himself the week he went, and no one ever saw him again. He told her his name was Tobias Hale, that he had a place 2 miles up the valley, that he had been a young man when Amos Crane vanished, and was one of the few left alive who remembered him at all. He did not offer to help her. He sat his horse and watched her draw the last spike, and when the door swung free at last on its hand-forged hinges, groaning, releasing a breath of air that had been sealed in darkness for 30 years, the old man took off his hat without seeming to know he had done it. The inside of the smokehouse was not what the valley expected, and it was not what Hannah expected either. There were no meat hooks, there was no rack, no fire pit, no sign that any meat had ever hung in that air. There was only a small, clean, empty room, the walls scorched dark as if a fire had once burned in it, a single stool, and a floor of heavy plank laid so tight that 30 years of dust had found nowhere to settle between the boards. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust, and Tobias Hale stood behind her in the failing light, and neither of them spoke. "A smokehouse with no hooks is not a smokehouse," Hannah said at last, mostly to herself. "It is a room pretending to be one." She slept that night inside the building she now owned, on the bare, scorched floor, and in the morning she sent Tobias Hale's curiosity to good use. She asked him to tell her everything the valley remembered about Amos Crane and the old man, who had clearly waited 30 years for someone to ask, told her over the better part of a day while she examined the floor on her hands and knees. Amos Crane had come into the Bitterroot in the late 50s. Tobias said, a quiet man with a wife named Clara and money enough to buy good bottomland when most folks were still squatting. He had built up a fine place, run cattle, lent money to neighbors at fair terms when the bank in Hamilton would not. He had been, by every account, an honest man, and an honest man with cash in a poor valley makes both friends and a particular kind of enemy. The enemy, Tobias said, had a name, and the name was Royce Dunmore. Dunmore had owned the bank in Hamilton and a good deal else besides. He had not liked a private man lending money at terms the bank could not match, and he had liked it less when Amos Crane began buying up the notes of farmers Dunmore meant to foreclose, paying their debts and letting them keep their land. There had been words between the two men in public more than once. And then in the autumn of 1857, Clara Crane had died of a fever, and within the month Amos Crane had sealed his smokehouse with his own forged spikes and vanished from the valley, and Royce Dunmore's bank had produced a stack of notes proving that Crane owed the bank everything he had. And had taken the whole of the Crane place in settlement. Folks figured Crane killed himself from grief or ran off broke, Tobias said. The bank had the paper. The paper said he owed. When a man owes and then he is gone, nobody asks too many questions about the paper. Hannah Vesper listened to all of it with her hands moving across the floor, and what her hands were telling her did not match what the valley believed. The floor was the most carefully made thing in the building, and the building was the most carefully made thing on the property. That was the wrongness she could not let go of. A man seals a smokehouse, fine. The question that would not leave her was why a man would lay a floor in a smokehouse like a cabinet maker laying a chest of drawers, every plank tongued and grooved into its neighbor, every joint snug enough to turn water, in a building meant to hang dead hogs. She had spent 2 days now reading that floor the way Eli had taught her, crawling its length on her hands and knees in the gray morning light before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, when raking light is kindest to a worker trying to read a surface. She had run her bare palm over every board, feeling for the half-degree of difference in wear that tells where a man stood often and where he never stood at all. She had tapped each plank with a knuckle and listened to the note it gave back. Because a board laid over solid earth sounds dead, and a board laid over a hollow sings, however faintly. For 2 days, the floor had sung the same dead note everywhere, and she had begun to wonder whether her hands had finally lied to her. Then, on the second afternoon, near the center of the room, one plank gave back a different sound, a sound with a little air behind it, and she found, kneeling over it, a single plank that had been cut and fitted with even more care than the rest. It was the care that gave it away. Look for the care, Eli had said, and you will find what the care was protecting. She did not pry the plank up the first time she found it. She studied it. She found that it was not nailed at all where every other plank was pegged, and that its tongue had been waxed where the others were dry, so that it would slide free without a sound and without a mark. The man who built this floor had built one plank to be lifted, and had built it so well that for 30 years no one who walked across it had ever known. She knelt over it a long time. Then she fetched the thinnest of Eli's chisels, slid it into the seam where the waxed tongue met its neighbor, and lifted, slow and even, the way a man lifts a sleeping child he does not wish to wake. The plank rose without a sound, exactly as the builder had meant it to, exactly as it had risen for him 30 years before, and a breath of cold air came up out of the dark beneath it, air that had been shut away from the world since before she was born. Below the plank was a space, lined and dry, a small joined box of cedar set into the floor frame as neatly as a drawer, and in the space was a tin box, and inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was the truth that Royce Dunmore had spent 30 years and a great deal of other people's money to bury. There were papers. Hannah lifted them out one by one in the lantern light, her hands steady, Tobias Hale leaning in the doorway with his hat in his fists. There were the original promissory notes, the real ones signed by a dozen valley farmers, showing the debts Amos Crane had bought up and forgiven, marked paid in Crane's own hand, every one. There was a ledger in a careful, joinery precise script that recorded every dollar Crane had lent and every dollar repaid, and the ledger did not show a man drowning in debt to the Hamilton Bank. It showed a man to whom the bank itself owed money. Money Dunmore had borrowed quietly to cover his own bad speculations and had never repaid. And folded beneath, all of it, was a letter, in the same careful hand, addressed to whoever should one day be honest enough or stubborn enough to lift the plank. Hannah read the letter aloud, because Tobias Hale asked her to, and because the old man's eyes had gone wet and he could not have read it himself. Amos Crane had written it the week his wife died. He had known by then that Dunmore meant to ruin him, that the notes the bank would produce against him were forgeries, that a man with a bank and a friendly judge in Hamilton could manufacture any debt he pleased, and that no court in the territory would take the word of a private citizen over the ledgers of an institution. He had written that he was not running, though he knew it would look that way. He was going east alone to find the one lawyer in the territorial capital who could not be bought, and he was leaving the proof behind him, sealed where Dunmore would never think to look, and could never get at, because a man like Dunmore would tear apart a house and never once kneel down to study a floor. If you have found this, Amos Crane had written, then either I have come back for it myself, or I never came back at all. If it is the second thing, then I am asking a stranger to do what I could not. The debts in this box are forgiven, and the men who signed them owe nothing. The bank owes what its own ledger shows. Set it right if you can. A thing built to hold will hold until the right hand opens it. He had never come back. Whatever befell Amos Crane on the road east, in the autumn of 1857, the valley would never know, and Hannah did not pretend to. The plank, though, had held for 30 years, and the right hand had come at last. And the proof was in the lantern light on a scorched floor, and it was undeniable. What she felt then was not triumph. Ellie had taught her there is no triumph in finding the truth, only the weight of it, and the weight of what she held was considerable. She sat back on her heels in the cold and let the size of it settle on her. A man had built this room not to smoke meat, but to outlast a lie. He had built it the way Eli built a cask, to hold what was put into it, and let nothing out, and he had trusted against all reason that some day someone would read his care and understand. She had read it. The responsibility was hers now, whether she wanted it or not. Royce Dunmore was an old man by 1887. But he was not dead, and he still owned the bank in Hamilton, and his son sat in the territorial legislature. Hannah understood the danger of what she held as clearly as she understood the floor. A poor woman with no people, waving 30-year-old papers at a powerful man, would be the easiest thing in the world to dismiss as a lunatic or a fraud. Eli had taught her that an accusation is only noise, but a thing made true cannot be argued with. She did not need to accuse Royce Dunmore of anything. She needed only to make the truth so solid that it could stand in a room by itself. So she did not ride to Hamilton and shout. She worked the way she always worked, methodically and without haste, and she let Tobias Hale carry word quietly up and down the valley to the families whose names were on the forgiven notes. They came to the Smokehouse 1 and 2 at a time over the following week, weathered men and women who had spent 30 years believing they had been let off a debt by a man who then died a defaulter, and Hannah showed each of them the note that bore their family's name, marked "Paid in Amos Crane's hand," and the date and the amount, and watched understanding move across their faces. She did not tell them what to think. She showed them what was true and let them think it themselves. A man named Gideon Walsh came on the third day, a rancher of 50 with a stiff leg and a suspicious mouth, certain he was being worked for money somehow, because in his experience no stranger ever showed a man a kindness without a hook in it. He stood in the smokehouse doorway with his hat on and his arms folded and waited to catch her in the lie. She did not argue with him. She laid the note with the name Walsh on it in his hands and let him read his own father's signature, and the date beside it, the autumn his family had nearly lost their bottomland, and she watched the suspicion go out of his face like water out of a cracked jug. He had been 12 that year, he said quietly. He remembered the men coming for the land. He remembered his father weeping at the kitchen table, and then he remembered, a week later, his father weeping again, differently, because a neighbor named Crane had made it right and asked nothing. He had forgotten the second weeping. He had carried only the first for 40 years. He gave her back the note with both hands, the way a man returns something holy, and he did not put his hat back on until he was outside. One of them was a woman named Sarah Polk, perhaps 60, who had come west as a girl with the family, whose farm Amos Crane had saved from Dunmore's foreclosure in 1856. She held the note in both hands and read her dead father's signature and the word paid beside it, and she wept without sound for a while, and then she said the thing that turned the loose proof into a case. "My father always said Amos Crane saved us, and we never could thank him," Sarah Polk said. "He said the bank came for our land, and Crane bought the note out from under them and tore it up in front of us. There were 6 of us children watching. He told us to remember it. He said one day somebody would say, Amos Crane was a thief, and we should be ready to say he was not. There were 6 witnesses to that single act, then scattered now across 2 counties, and Sarah Polk knew where most of them were. The ledger named a dozen more transactions, each with its own witnesses, its own families who remembered. The box had given Hannah the documents. The valley, once it knew to look, gave her the living memory to stand behind them. A forged deed is one man's word against a dead man's silence. A dozen families saying the same thing, each holding a note in a dead man's hand, was no longer a silence. Dunmore could fill with his own paper. Through all of this, the old patterns held. The men who had laughed at the auction did not come and apologize, because that is not how such men are made. But they grew quiet, and then they grew curious, and one by one they found reasons to ride past the smokehouse and look at it with new eyes. The building they had called a coffin had turned out to be a strongbox, and the woman they had called a fool had turned out to be the only person in 30 years who had bothered to ask why a meat shed was dovetailed at the corners. Tobias Hale, who had become her constant ally, told her one evening that the valley had begun to call the place the Crane Box, and that the auctioneer who sold it to her for $2 had stopped telling the joke about the smokehouse that smoked nothing but patience. She let none of it turn her head. She had a thing to finish, and finishing it required the one kind of help she could not get from a valley of farmers. She needed a lawyer who could not be bought, the same kind of man Amos Crane had ridden east to find and never reached. It was Sarah Polk who knew of one. A circuit attorney named Crowell, she said, who rode the territorial courts and had made enemies of every bank in 3 counties by taking the cases of people the banks had ruined. He was in the valley that very season, hearing a land dispute in Hamilton. Hannah copied the ledger and the letter by hand, by lantern over 2 nights in her own careful script, so that if the originals were ever taken from her, the truth would survive in more than one place. Then she rode to Hamilton with the originals sewn into the lining of her coat, and the copies left with Tobias Hale, and she found the attorney Crowell in the back room of a boarding house, and she did not plead with him. She laid the papers on the table and let him read. He read for a long time. He was a heavy, slow-moving man with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, and he read the way a careful man reads, twice the second time slower than the first, holding the original notes up to the window light to study the ink and the hand. He set Amos Crane's notes in one row and asked Hannah to describe again exactly where she had found them, and she told him the floor, the waxed plank, the cedar-lined space, and he nodded slowly, because a document is only as good as the account of where it came from, and her account did not waver in a single particular. When he finished, he looked at her the way the old man had looked at the smokehouse the night the door came open. He asked her where she had gotten the documents, and she told him, plainly, the floor, the wax plank, the tin box, the 30 years. He asked if there were witnesses to the underlying debts, and she gave him Sarah Polk's name and the names of 5 families besides, and the year and the substance of what each of them remembered. He wrote the names down in a small book without being asked twice. He asked, last, what she wanted out of it, and that question she had been ready for since the night she lifted the plank. "I do not want anything out of it," Hannah said. "The debts in that box are forgiven, and the families owe nothing, and they should have the paper that proves it so no bank can ever come at them again. The bank owes what its own ledger shows, and that is between the bank and the law. I bought a building for $2. I did not buy a fortune. I buy and I sell my own labor, and that is all I have ever wanted to own." Crowell looked at her for a while. Then he said that in 30 years of practice he had met very few people who, holding the kind of leverage she held, wanted only to give it away, and that it made him inclined to believe every word she had said because liars wanted things and she wanted nothing. He took the case. What followed took the better part of a year, and it took place mostly in rooms Hannah Vesper never entered, in the slow-grinding machinery of the territorial courts, and it is not the part of the story the Valley tells. The Valley tells the part that happened in the open. It tells how the original notes, set beside the bank's notes, showed two different hands where there should have been one, and how a clerk who had worked for Royce Dunmore as a young man and carried 30 years of shame finally said under oath what he had done with a pen. It tells how the ledger Amos Crane had kept in his joinery precise script proved to balance to the penny against the records of every man he had dealt with, while the bank's records, examined the same way, did not. It tells how the truth, once it stood in the room by itself, did exactly what Eli Vesper had promised a true thing would do, which was to need no help from anyone. Royce Dunmore was never dragged into a courtroom to be confronted, never made to stand and answer. Hannah had not wanted that, and the truth did not require it. The old man's foundation had been paper, and when the paper proved false, the foundation simply dissolved beneath him. His son withdrew from the legislature rather than answer questions about the family's holdings. The bank in Hamilton was found to have built a portion of its assets on debts that had never existed and obligations it had concealed, and it did not survive the finding. Royce Dunmore died the following winter in a house he no longer fully owned, and the Valley noted his passing the way it notes a hard frost as a thing that had been coming for a long time, and surprised no one when it came. He was undone, not by a gun, not by a confrontation, not by any hand raised against him, but by a floor he had never thought to kneel down and study. The families whose names were in the box received, each of them, the note in Amos Crane's hand marked paid, entered into the county record, so that no bank could ever again claim what had been forgiven. Sarah Polk framed hers and hung it where her father's chair had stood. The Crane homestead, taken by the bank 30 years before on forged debt, was a tangle of law that took years more to settle, and much of it had passed through too many hands to be returned. The corner lot, though, the quarter acre with the smokehouse, belonged free and clear to Hannah Vesper, who had paid $2 for it, and that was hers to do with as she pleased. She did not sell it. A speculator from Hamilton offered her a sum that would have kept her comfortable for years, on the theory that the Crane box had become famous, and famous things draw money, and she turned him down without taking time to think about it. She had not done any of this to become the thing she had undone. She kept the smokehouse, and she kept the tools, and she settled in the Bitterroot Valley, and she took up the trade Eli Vesper had raised her in, joinery and coopering and the making of tight things, in a country that had learned the hard way to respect a woman who could read a floor. Tobias Hale lived 4 more years and spent a good many evenings of them sitting on the stool inside the smokehouse while Hannah worked at her bench in the lengthening light, the two of them mostly silent, the old man content at last to have lived long enough to see Amos Crane's name said with honor again. When he died, she buried him with her own hands as she had buried Eli, and she did not weep at either grave, because grief in her was a thing she did with her hands and not her eyes, but she kept both men with her in the only way she knew, which was to go on doing the work they had valued. Years later, when Hannah Vesper was an old woman herself, and the Valley had filled in around her with fences and houses and people who had never heard the name Dunmore, a young man came to her bench, wanting to learn the trade, an orphan with no people that anyone could name. She watched him for a week before she said a word to him, the way Eli had watched her, and when she finally spoke, she did not offer him pity. She taught him the way she had been taught, that wood remembers the hand that worked it, that the most honest part of any building is the part underfoot, that a thing built to hide is built more carefully than a thing built to use. And once, when he asked her how she had come to own the old smokehouse that the Valley still called the Crane box, she told him the whole of it, The $2, the forged spikes, the waxed plank, the tin box, the 30 years. He asked her at the end whether she had been afraid, a poor woman with nothing, taking on a banker and a court. She thought about it for a while, her hands still moving over the wood, before she answered. "I was never taking on the banker," she said. "I was only opening a thing that had been built to be opened. The man who built that floor trusted that somebody would come along who knew how to read it. All I did was be the somebody. A thing built to hold will hold until the right hand opens it." He was right about that. He was right about most things, I expect, which is why a powerful man went to such trouble to make him look like a liar. The Smokehouse stands yet at the corner of a quarter-acre in the Bitterroot Valley, its dovetailed corners square as the day they were cut, its hand-forged hinges still swinging true. The waxed plank in the center of the floor lifts as silently as it ever did, though there is nothing beneath it now but a clean, dry space and the memory of what once lay there. On the bench inside, where the light comes long and gold in the late afternoon, a set of joiner's tools hangs in order on the wall, worn smooth at the handles by 3 generations of hands, and a thin pry and a wooden mallet rest where they were last set down. They were used to draw 4 hand-forged spikes out of seasoned wood, a long time ago, by a woman who understood that the world is full of things sealed shut and waiting, and that the only thing they are ever waiting for is the right hand and the patience to use it. If you have ever been counted for nothing by people who never troubled to look closer, I would like to know what you would have done with a sealed door and 2 silver dollars. And if this story sat with you the way the old ones do, there is another I can tell you, about a derelict stagecoach wedged high in a red rock canyon, and the woman who climbed to reach what was locked inside it,